When you watch a superhero movie, you always get an origin story. How did they get their powers? Who were they before? The US government has an origin story too. The founders didn't just invent it in a locked room one day. It was a messy, complicated process. They took a little bit of ancient history, a lot of English tradition, and mixed it all together with their own brand new experiences of living and fighting in America. This origin story explains why our government is structured the way it is. The first ingredient comes from ancient Greece. In the city of Athens, they invented this radical idea called democracy, which literally means rule by the people. All the citizens would gather in the town square and vote on every single law. Now that's called a direct democracy, and it wouldn't work in a country of 330 million people. Can you imagine trying to get everyone in one place to vote on a traffic law? But the idea that power comes from the people, that was the starting point for everything. The next ingredient came from ancient Rome. The Romans knew a direct democracy was too chaotic for a big territory, so they created a republic. In a republic, the people still have the power, but they elect representatives, smart, capable people, to go to the capital and make laws for them. When you hear people pledge allegiance to the flag and to the republic for which it stands, this is what they're talking about. We don't all vote on every law. We vote for senators and congresspeople to go and do that job for us. Fast forward about 1700 years to England. The king was a total tyrant, doing whatever he wanted, taking land, throwing people in jail for no reason. The nobles, called barons, got so fed up that in 1215 they cornered King John and forced him to sign the Magna Carta, or Great Charter. This document, for the first time, said that the king was not above the law. He couldn't just take property or jail someone without a good reason and a fair trial. This is the seed of two huge American ideas: limited government and due process. About 400 years later, the English did it again. After another fight with the king, Parliament passed the English Bill of Rights in 1689. This document was a huge inspiration for our own Bill of Rights. It guaranteed things like the freedom to petition the government, and it banned cruel and unusual punishment. The American colonists saw these as their rights too, the rights of all English citizens. So when the king later violated these rights, they got very angry. Now we get to the big ideas phase, called the Enlightenment. The most important thinker for America was John Locke. He came up with two game-changing concepts. First, natural rights. He said you are born with the right to life, liberty, and property. Nobody gives them to you, and no government can take them away. Second, he said we create a social contract. This means we, the people, agree to give up a little bit of freedom to create a government. But the only reason we create that government is to protect our natural rights. If it fails to do that, we have the right to change it. You can hear this all over the Declaration of Independence. The other big brain was a French thinker named Montesquieu. He studied governments all over the world and realized that anytime one person or group gets all the power, things go bad. They become corrupt and take away people's rights. His big idea was separation of powers. He said the best way to protect liberty is to split the government into three branches: one to make the laws, one to enforce the laws, and one to judge the laws. That way, no one branch can become a tyrant. This is the entire blueprint for our three-branch system. While all these ideas were floating around, the colonists were actually practicing self-government. When the Pilgrims landed in 1620, they were totally on their own, so they wrote the Mayflower Compact. It was a simple agreement to combine ourselves together into a civil body politic and make their own rules. And even earlier, when Virginia, they had already created the House of Burgesses. This was a mini parliament where elected representatives met to pass local laws. For over 100 years, colonists got really, really good at running their own lives. Why was Britain letting them do this? It's a policy called salutary neglect. It sounds like a fancy term, but salutary means beneficial, and neglect means to ignore. So it was beneficial neglect. Britain was busy fighting expensive wars in Europe, and as long as the colonies were shipping raw materials and making money for the mother country, Britain just left them alone. This was like a teenager whose parents go away for the weekend. The colonists got a taste of freedom and loved it. And then the party was over. In 1754, Britain and France started a massive war in America called the French and Indian War. It was basically a fight over who would control the valuable Ohio Valley. Britain won the war and kicked France out of North America, which was great. But the war was unbelievably expensive. Britain was in massive debt, and King George III looked at the colonies, who were now safe from the French, and said, "All right, you are going to help me pay for this." This was the moment everything changed. The hands-off policy of salutary neglect was over. To pay off that war debt, Britain's Parliament started passing a series of taxes on the colonists. The Stamp Act taxed all paper goods, the Townshend Acts taxed glass and tea, and so on. The colonists were just mad about the money. They were mad about the principle. They had no representatives in the British Parliament. They had no one to vote for them or speak for them. So they raised the famous slogan, "No taxation without representation." The colonists started to protest, and things got heated. In 1770, a crowd of angry colonists threw snowballs and rocks at British soldiers, who panicked and fired, killing 5 people. This was the Boston Massacre. Then in 1773, to protest a tax on tea, colonists disguised themselves, boarded British ships, and dumped 342 chests of tea into Boston Harbor. The Boston Tea Party. Britain was furious. They responded by passing the Intolerable Acts, which shut down Boston's port and put Massachusetts under military rule. This was the final straw. The colonists saw this as an act of war. 2 years later, the breakup was official. The Second Continental Congress asked Thomas Jefferson to write the Declaration of Independence. This document is a perfect summary of John Locke's ideas. It famously says, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." It then gives a long list of all the ways the king had violated their rights and officially cuts all ties with Britain. So, we declared independence. Now what? We needed a government. But remember, we had just fought a war against what we saw as a tyrant king. The last thing the states wanted was to create another powerful, bossy, central government. So they created the Articles of Confederation. This was our first attempt at a national government. And it was incredibly weak on purpose. It was more like a firm league of friendship than a real country. The states kept almost all the power for themselves. The Articles of Confederation was like a group project where no one is in charge. The National Congress could pass laws, but it couldn't enforce them. It had no power to tax, so it literally had to go around to each state and ask for money. Can you imagine how well that worked? There was no president to lead the country and no national court system to settle arguments between states. If Virginia and Maryland were in a fight, there was no referee. It quickly became clear that this system just wasn't working. The moment everyone realized the Articles were a disaster was Shays' Rebellion. Farmers who were Revolutionary War veterans were in deep debt and were losing their farms to foreclosure. They were being taxed by their own state, and they couldn't pay. So Daniel Shays led a mob of angry farmers to shut down the state courts. The national government was helpless. It had no money and no army to send. It was a huge embarrassment. Leaders like George Washington and James Madison realized that the house was on fire, and they needed a stronger government fast. Because of the panic from Shays' Rebellion, Leaders from 12 of the 13 states agreed to meet in Philadelphia in 1787. Their official job was just to fix or amend the Articles of Confederation, but they quickly realized the articles were unfixable. Led by James Madison, they threw the whole thing in the trash and decided to start from scratch. They locked the doors, swore themselves to secrecy, and spent the entire summer hammering out a brand new plan, the Constitution. The biggest fight at the convention was between the big states and the small states. The big states, like Virginia, wanted representation in Congress to be based on population. The more people you have, the more votes you get. The small states, like New Jersey, hated this. They were afraid they'd be bullied, so they demanded equal representation. The fight almost ended the convention, until they came up with the Great Compromise. They created a two-house Congress. The House of Representatives would be based on population, which made the big states happy. The Senate would have equal representation, 2 per state, which made the small states happy. After the Constitution was written, it had to be ratified or approved by at least 9 of the 13 states. This led to another huge fight. The Federalists, like Alexander Hamilton and James Madison, loved the new Constitution. They argued it was a perfect balance of power and wrote a series of essays called the Federalist Papers to defend it. But the anti-federalists, like Patrick Henry, were terrified. They thought this new federal government was a monster. They worried the president would become a king and that the government would just crush the rights of the people. The anti-federalists had one huge, very powerful complaint. Where is the list of our rights? They refused to sign without a Bill of Rights that explicitly protected things like free speech, religion, and the right to a trial by jury. This was the final deal. The Federalists promised, "Fine, if you ratify the Constitution now, the very first thing we will do in the new Congress is add a Bill of Rights." The anti-federalists agreed, and the Constitution was passed. Those first 10 amendments, added in 1791, are what we now call the Bill of Rights, and they are the final piece of the American government's origin story.